Afternoon. Okay, so I want to begin with.
Oh wait, I've got to click back onto the right screen.
Ah,
I think.
okay.
Sorry.
Brilliant. So I want to begin, here's an image of Piers Corbyn. Piers Corbyn is probably Britain's leading anti-vaccination, anti-lockdown campaigner. And here you can see Corbyn speaking at a rally where the placards are stressing these vaccines are harming our teens. Why vaccinate teens and so on, with reference to the COVID-19 vaccines. Any of you who've spent long enough listening to Corbyn and fellow anti-vaxxers speaking will know they're obsessed by the question of vaccinating teens, and they're obsessed for a very good reason. They will tell you that the government's own vaccination experts advised against routine vaccination of teens, and they are right. That's the starting point for my talk today, okay? So what I'm interested in this talk is the following kind of situation. We have a curious case of COVID-19 vaccines for teens. I'll run through this case in a bit more detail shortly, but this is a case where the government was given advice and it rejected its own advice from its own scientific advisors, yeah? And that seems to give us, in some sense, a very simple kind of question. Should we infer that we have bad advice? Or should we infer we have bad advisees? Yeah? On the face of it, it seems very hard to understand how you can have good advice which you simultaneously reject. In the second part of the talk, I want to try to give an account or understanding of what's going on in the advice which the government got about vaccination. And specifically, I want to suggest there's something really interesting going on here about how the government's own advisors understood the relationship between uncertainty and medical intervention. So I think they were driven by a concern of non-maleficence. I'm going to spell this out. The next part of the talk, I'm going to suggest a generalization of this kind of picture I give you in section 2. I'm going to suggest that another really interesting COVID debate, the debate over face masks, has exactly the same structure. And that from this, we might be able to see a larger pattern emerging. Okay? And this larger pattern involves a claim I want to make that medically trained people work in an epistemic tradition which adopts a distinctive set of views towards uncertainty grounded on a particular set of ethical understandings. I'm not saying this is happening consciously. I'm saying that the epistemic traditions which get passed down may reflect these concerns. If so, I think there's a really interesting question about what then happens to our understanding of advice and policy in cases where we might think those uncertainty attitudes are improper or somehow out of place. And that leads to my final suggestion that we need to rethink the Weberian distinction between a scientist and a politician along the lines of a giant elephant. I'll come back to explain that metaphor shortly. So that's the structure of the talk. As I said, you can already see there's probably too much in there, so I apologise. Let me give you a background to my case. As we've already seen this morning, I feel really bad going so late because I feel there's lots of links between what I say and all the other talks, and as I'll try to make the links as I go, but I apologise if I miss stuff out. Yeah? In discussions of governmental advice during COVID-19, there's been a lot of focus on the role of SAGE, but of course SAGE is not the only government committee which is giving advice. And in some ways, there are other committees which are more interesting, or at least I want to argue. One of these committees in the UK is the JCBI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. So the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation is a long-established, arm's-length government body which has a statutory role when it comes to legislation involving vaccination and immunisation. Very roughly, the JCBI decides on proposed vaccination programmes in the UK, and if the JCBI recommends a programme, then the Minister of Health has to at least consider the programme, whereas if they rule against a programme, then the Minister of Health cannot go ahead with the programme. Okay? So they serve a very important gatekeeping function. Now, for the last 25 years or so, I think it's been in existence, if you look at JCBI minutes, they're quite boring. And like SAGE, JCBI minutes are all online. Interesting. Yeah, they really are like, slight change to diphtheria vaccination. Should we do or should we do not? Suddenly, of course, during COVID, they become incredibly important. Why? Because vaccination is meant to be our key way out of a pandemic. But of course, vaccination raises a series of issues. Here's one thing the JCBI do very quickly in 2020, before we even have a vaccine. They draw up a potential priority list for vaccination. So, interestingly, the JCBI go for this age-based approach, where they vaccinate the oldest first on the basis that they have a highest risk. But of course, this is a completely controversial decision for anyone who knows that there are large debates in the vaccination community, but instead the most effective overall strategy is to vaccinate basically middle-aged people so they don't spread disease around the population. So JCBI make a series of decisions. A key concern after a vaccine is rolled out concerns side effects. Okay, so famously the JCBI decided against offering the AstraZeneca vaccine to under 30s on the grounds that there were concerns that the AstraZeneca vaccine occasionally causes cardiac problems. In the summer of 2021, sorry, I was missing a word on your slide, the JCBI is asked about, as it were, so far we've been considering a vaccine rollout to about 20. They're now asked, should the vaccine be given to adolescent children, basically between 12 and 15? In summer 2021, the JCBI consider this question and they decide against giving the vaccine to this age group. We'll come back to this in a sec. Yeah.
Didn't they get a distinction between families that had vulnerable people in them?
Sorry, you're right. So against a routine rollout. So already, if you're in a vulnerable, yeah, you're right. Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting question throughout the pandemic about the notion of a household in vaccination strategy, because the JCBI rely heavily on household, but never define it properly. But yeah, you're completely right. But this is routine rollout to school children, basically. The JCBI's decision causes controversy, for reasons I'll go into very shortly. But basically, part of controversy is just other places are doing it, why don't we? Yeah? The government asks the chief medical officers for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to reconsider the decision, and the CMOs decide, in fact, it's okay. That's roughly the story. Now, clearly, I take it this entire story is like really interesting for anyone who's interested in policy making. Yeah, it's got this odd feature. Your advisors advise, you don't like the advice you get, you go back to a different group of advisors, and then you get the advice you kind of want for political reasons, and then you go ahead. No wonder people like Corbyn love this case. Yeah? But what's interesting to me is the JCBI's reasoning for having, for not rolling out the vaccine. And there's a kind of report, and the report contains this really confusing summary. But the summary says, the health benefits from vaccination are marginally greater than the potential known harms. However, the margin of benefit is considered too small to support universal vaccination of healthy 12 to 15-year-olds at this time. Given the very low risk of serious COVID-19 disease in otherwise healthy 12 to 15-year-olds, considerations of the potential harm and benefits of vaccinations are very finely balanced, and a precautionary approach was agreed. So it's a funny way they seem to say, this is really hard. Overall, though, it looks like it's just about in the interests of 12 to 15-year-olds, but we're not certain, so we won't do it. What's going on in this kind of incredible quote? I think there are three things which came up in the subsequent debate. This is one of those funny COVID debates, which raged for about 2 weeks, and then everyone forgets about after. Yeah? One is, there's this interesting question that they limit any discussion of vaccination to medical harms and benefits. So lots of people said this, they'd say, well, hold on, there's huge benefits to vaccination. If you vaccinate the kids, they can go to school, and then they won't miss school. And then there's, of course, a counter-argument which goes, well, the only reason unvaccinated children would miss school would be if you had a rule about not allowing unvaccinated children to go to school. So it's a really hard question about harms and benefits, how to count them. What the JCBI do, however, is limit consideration to medical harms and benefits, as it were. It's narrow scope, harms and benefits. Second, this is what drove people like Neil Ferguson really, really angry about this decision. They limit consideration to harms and benefits to recipients. Yeah? They say the health when they say that the health benefits outweigh the health costs, they mean the health benefits to 12 to 15-year-olds. Here's a standard answer to that. But hold on. You vaccinate the kids, Maybe they protect their grandma. Maybe they protect their school teachers. Maybe they stop transmission in the community. The JCBI ignore the transmission question entirely. Yeah? This is entirely consistent with what we did throughout the pandemic. Although suddenly, when it comes to kids, people seem far happier to view kids as vectors. But that's a different issue. Okay? The third interesting issue here is the issue I've already brought up, the handling of uncertainty. Yeah? You might think of something really strange, because you could say, oh, we've narrowed medical harms and benefits, we've narrowed the harms to benefits to recipients, and still it's positive. And then you're like, but hold on, we're not certain, so we won't do it. So that's like the controversy around the JCBI's decision. What I want to do is I want to go through this decision and try to give you an account of what's going on. Consider the first two aspects I gave you. They focus on medical harms and benefits, and they don't look at transmission. What's going on in those first two aspects? Here's an interpretation. I think at least aspect one suggests, seriously, we just got people here who are reasoning as doctors, as it were, yeah? They're not thinking of themselves as people concerned with educational effects. They're not concerned even with broader epidemiological effects. They are thinking of themselves primarily as doctors. And you look at the composition of a JCBI, and lots of people are coming out of medical practice, yeah? As doctors, what are they doing when they don't look at transmission? Well, I think this is very complicated, but I think the focus on the harms and benefits to the affected vaccinated individuals is a version of so-called non-maleficence principle. Famously, doctors are meant to abide by this principle of do no harm. Famously, do no harm is awfully difficult to interpret, but here's one way of understanding it. You know, classic kind of case we've all taught our students. If I could kill Joe and redistribute his organs to 5 people, each of whom needs an organ transplant, that would, in some sense, be in the service of beneficence, but I'm not allowed to do it. As a doctor, certainly. Why is a doctor not allowed to do it? Because the first duty is do no harm. Yeah? Do no harm, and the certainty puts limits on these interpersonal trade-offs, Joe versus 5 people. What happens to do no harm under conditions of risk? Well, this is tricky, but I think one way of understanding non-maleficence under risk is a requirement that interventions, medical interventions, must meet something like an ex-ante Pareto condition. What I mean here is just non-technically, they have to improve the prospects of each person you're affecting. Yeah? So what I can't do is I can't kind of impose a risk on Joe, a non-compensated risk on Joe, for the sake of helping other people. Yeah? You know, it's like I can't put him at a 50% chance of losing his 5 organs, unless there's some countervailing benefit to him. I mean, I've argued for this elsewhere. I mean, this is kind of technically argument, but you don't need the technical argument. I think this is kind of intuitive, yeah? Doctors shouldn't go around risking patients unless it's for the benefit of that patient, roughly. Okay? And I think non-maleficence understood this way is non-trivial in vaccination cases, precisely for the reasons I gave you, yeah? What it means is I can't vaccinate Joe, hence actually decreasing his overall prospects because there's a risk of a side effect, for the sake of protecting everyone else. It matters, but Joe's prospects, Joe's chances of harm and benefit are themselves improved. Why think non-maleficence is key in vaccination cases? Well, doctors take it seriously. When you vaccinate people, you make an offer. And when you make an offer, you take on responsibility for the consequences of them accepting the offer. Note, vaccination isn't like a normal medical procedure where the patient comes to you, and so to a certain extent, considerations of autonomy are key. In vaccination, you go to the patient. Yeah? You are, as it were, making the offer, so you take on board the duty of non-maleficence. So here's my interpretation. The first 2 parts of what a JCBI do suggest that they're thinking primarily of their decision in terms of non-maleficence, not beneficence. But still, even on this interpretation, we've got the really weird way we think about uncertainty. What's going on there? Well, think about ambiguity aversion. I feel awful going to to talk about ambiguity. I'm going to be in so much trouble. But anyway, I'm going to do my best, okay? Ambiguity aversion, I'm going to understand here, is just a preference for gambles which have known odds over gambles which have unknown odds, even when the latter have lower expectation. You expect to win less. So, you know, you've got 2 bags, there's 100 balls in. One case, we kind of know the proportion of ballers. One case we don't know the proportion of ballers. You'll find lots of people will prefer a gamble where they know the odds over a gamble where they don't know the odds, even if, via indifference, the second gamble looks like it's a better bet. Yeah? People don't like betting on uncertain odds. That's all I need for now. Here's a suggestion from Rowan Verhoeven. They suggest, here's a way of capturing ambiguity aversion in social decision making. You calculate people's prospects, you calculate how much you expect to win and lose, but then, to the extent you are uncertain about the gamble, as it were, you multiply through by some ambiguity aversion constant, okay? So maybe, in this case, strictly, in the case where you don't know the proportions, you could calculate the prospects, but, and that's £7, 50% chance for 4, 50% chance for £10, £7, but you dampen it, because it's uncertain. You don't need to worry too much about the details here. Here's all I want to tell you. That's, I think, what the JCBI do. First, they calculate as it were the prospects. They're like, is it in children's interests to have a vaccine? Yes or no? Overall, yeah, the expected health benefits outweigh the expected health costs. And then they say, but hold on, we're uncertain. What should we do? We dampen, yeah? We reduce, we take it down. But they do something even weirder. They dampen asymmetrically. So here's what I mean, yeah? Strictly, there's lots of uncertainty about what happens if you vaccinate, but there's lots of uncertainty about what happens if you don't vaccinate in the middle of a bloody pandemic. But they don't care about that uncertainty. They only care about one side of the uncertainty. They apply ambiguity aversion asymmetrically. Okay, so here's my second claim. The JCBI responds to uncertainty in a way which involves this asymmetric ambiguity aversion. Okay, now here's one option. You can say, what's going on there? Option A, asymmetric ambiguity aversion is just some weird taste. Sometimes the literature on ambiguity aversion treats it this way. Like, some people just don't like gambles. Like, yeah, some people just don't like vanilla ice cream. But here's a separate proposal, which I think has a nice kind of consilience aspect to it. I think we can argue, we can suggest, that asymmetric ambiguity aversion, what the JCBI does, is linked to non-maleficence. I think there's some sense in which the entire notion of doing no harm imposes this kind of requirement that one is particularly cautious about interventions and only interventions where one has high uncertainty about what's happening. And that's what's going on in the government's advice. From the advisors. I'm going to, so that's my proposal. I think there's a mapping from non-maleficence to forms of ambiguity aversion. That's my second option. Why? Well, partly I think it just explains our case. But here's a second case. An equally baffling case. The case of face masks in the pandemic. Yeah? So throughout the pandemic, we have this interesting feature where some scientists were opposed to policies encouraging or mandating face masks on the basis that there were no rigorous RCTs suggesting that face masks were effective. What also happens is you have other people say, well, the evidence is good enough. Yeah? We've got mechanistic evidence. We have evidence from what happens in countries where masking is routine, and so on. One way of understanding those debates is as it were, a broadly epistemic argument. Yeah, what evidence is good evidence? I don't think that's all that's going on in these debates. Yeah? Here's a way of understanding what's going on in these debates. So this is Trish Greenhall, who's a big proponent of masking, and she says, just in passing, when commenting on this, more specifically, taking a primum non nocere, don't act until we've got RCT certainty stance, when hundreds are dying daily, makes no scientific or moral sense. It is neither scientifically nor morally reckless to try policies that have a plausible chance of working. I'm really fascinated by primum non nocere equals don't act till we've got RCT certainty, yeah? I mean, I've taught medical ethics many times. When I introduce do no harm, I never say do no harm, also could be understood as don't act until you've got RCT certainty. But that's exactly how she understands her opponents. And I think she's onto something here. Yeah? Because here's what's interesting. The EBM people kind of randomized controlled people come out of EBM, evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine itself comes out of the clinic. It's done by doctors. By contrast, people who are pro-masks are typically modelers. They're typically people coming from an older public health tradition, which historically had a lot of engineers in, historically was linked into the utilitarian movement. Yeah? I think what's actually going on here is, as it were, a clash of ethical traditions disguised as something else almost. And here's a way of making that kind of more rigorous, but very general kind of idea. Let's just assume the EBM evidence hierarchy is more or less correct. Yeah? Just assume RCTs are really high, and meta-analyses even higher, and so on and so on and so on. Just assume it. I take it that if you assume this, here's an argument. Basing policy on RCTs is a bit like gambling on known odds. Yeah? What you're doing there is you haven't eliminated risk, but you, in your own mind, have eliminated uncertainty. By contrast, basing policy on something other than RCTs, on mechanistic evidence, on observational evidence, is like gambling on unknown or ambiguous odds. What happens if you follow ambiguity aversion? I think you think it's preferable to gamble on known odds. And what's going on here is that this preference which I think is ultimately linked back to a commitment to non-maleficence, is then translated into, as it were, broadly, what seems like an epistemic position. Yeah? I think there's a kind of great irony here, because I think people who like EBM often think of themselves as kind of great rationalists, but on my account, they're kind of really in this deontological tradition. Yeah? Meanwhile, their opponents, the public health people, who are like, well, we've got our known odds, but you know what? We'll take the gamble. They are an ambiguity neutral, are, as it were, adopting a truly, inverted commas, rational attitude in that case. So I think we have this rule often we employ, waiting for certainty. Don't ask for face masks until we're certain they work. It's an epistemic rule which is aimed at maintaining adherence to non-maleficence in medical policy. So, that was my proposal. I think there's a mapping from non-maleficence to some forms of ambiguity aversion, particularly asymmetric ambiguity aversion, option 2. In favour, it explains our case. Yeah? It also explains the face mask case. I take you have the same kind of story going on in both cases. I think it's intuitively plausible, actually. When I first kind of tried to figure this out, I thought these people were crazy. And I thought about real-life cases. There's all sorts of cases where I can imagine there's lots of uncertainty over the vaccine. Am I willing to vaccinate myself? Yeah. The same level of uncertainty, am I willing to vaccinate my own children? No. Why not? Well, broadly, because I think I've got special duties of care towards my children. And I think I'm not going to impose I'm not going to act under uncertainty. I'm not going to act this way towards my children because I would be violating that duty of care. Many might say that's irrational because, of course, your children, might still be a great risk of a disease. My answer to that might just be, yeah, but at least it wouldn't be my fault. I mean, I don't know if this is a kind of debunking explanation or not, but I think it's part of what's going on. Yeah? Finally, I think it fills out some mysteries in various debates. We have all these debates about choosing for others under situations of risk or situations of ambiguity or so on. I think here's one really nice way of seeing how we might get a mapping from various principles in medical ethics. Yeah? Big debate. When we are choosing for others, should we defer to their attitudes towards risk, their attitudes towards neutrality, towards ambiguity? Well, one worry is, one idea is maybe we should just be neutral. We should be ambiguity neutral with choosing for others. Why might we be ambiguity neutral? Well, in the long run, that's going to promote the good. But there are people saying, no, we need to find out people's risk attitudes. We need to find out their ambiguity attitudes. We need to defer to those in decision-making. Why should we do that? Well, Nicholas Makins has a paper where he says, because that's about respect for autonomy. But respect for autonomy and beneficence aren't the only principles doctors live by. They also live by non-maleficence. I think non-maleficence might mean some choices you might need to be ambiguity averse. And then one thing you might get there is you might understand why you have that work by people like Buchak, which says, well, you don't know, adopt this kind of assumption that people are risk averse. She doesn't say ambiguity averse, it's complex. But I think, well, why would you make that assumption? Well, here's one notion. If I'm acting on you, I have responsibility. to, as it were, not impose harm. So, that's a very kind of quick sketch of a claim. Where does it take us in terms of these issues around expertise, scientific advice, and so on? I think it takes us towards the notion of the elephant. Let me explain why, okay? So, in lots of work in recent philosophy, okay, so let's take a step back. There is this kind of ideal, I'm going to call the Weberian ideal. And it's a funny kind of ideal because it's unclear if Weber himself even held it, blah, blah, blah. But roughly, the ideal is the kind of, I put Weber's concept in fractious terms. Scientists advise, but policymakers decide. Yeah? And we've heard this repeated today, actually, by several of the speakers, of course. But of course, there is a problem which comes up very strongly in lots of recent philosophy of science, and the role of values in science in some ways, which is there are implicit value judgments shaping even apparently neutral advice. Yeah? And I take the concern here to be with even if a scientist follows the Weberian model at the first order, so they say, look, so, policymaker, you ask a question, I'll give you the facts relevant to that, answering that question, or they give hedged advice. If you have value X, do policy Y. Even in those cases which look like they're following the Viberian division of labour, there's a worry that the claims the scientists are accepting are themselves value-laden in ways which mean that even the neutral advice is implicitly value-laden. Yeah? And then that looks like it creates problems for a Weberian ideal. Because it looks like you think you're following Weber, you think you've got a division of labour, but you don't. That, I take it, is one way of understanding my case. Yeah? One way of understanding my case is you think that what's going on is the government has gone to the scientists and they've just said, face masks, good idea, not a good idea. Vaccinations for teenagers, good idea, not bad idea. The scientists are like, well, hold on, now you've given us a question in good Weberian terms. We will give you an answer. But on my account, no. The way the scientists are even thinking about what it would be to be certain here, what it would be to calculate prospects here, is implicitly shaped by commitment to a norm of non-maleficence in ways which I think are not transparent even to the scientists themselves. Yeah, that's a key part of my story, this kind of deep opacity. Here's one response you sometimes see to those kinds of worries. We need more democratization of scientific advice. Yeah, certainly the kind of views people like Pamuk have, it's also view people like Andrew Schroeder have, and so on. But I take it one lesson from my case, from my reading of the JCBI case, my reading of the face masks case, is that that's not enough. The reason that's not enough is because it underestimates the depth and the extent of fact-value entanglement. Yeah? If I'm right on my account, it's not just as if having some non-scientists in the room, people may suddenly go, oh, hold on, you're reflecting this view about non-maleficence. On my account, it's baked into things like relying on RCTs. It's baked into the entire system in ways which are inescapable. What does that tell us? I think where that takes us is to an alternative model. And in a way, I think this might be the model, which in some ways Jonathan was after earlier. He got there much more quickly than I did, as related to what Alfred said. This is a Chinese image of a famous Buddhist legend of a different blind man feeling different parts of the elephant. Many people know this story. So there's an elephant, and one blind man is feeling the tail. He's like, oh, this animal is kind of long and stringy. And one blind man is feeling the trunk. And he's like, this animal has like these giant rippling, and so on. Yeah? I take it that this is a model for understanding what happens when different scientists grapple with some complex social issue. Yeah? The medics are giving you one perspective, the medical perspective. The epidemiologists are giving you another perspective, the epidemiological perspective. But what you can't do is combine those medical and epidemiological perspectives directly because they are so different. Yeah? Well, the only way you can do it is by losing expertise. So here's a different way of understanding it. I take it what the policymaker has to do is not go to the scientists and, as it were, ask a question in the Viberian model. And instead, she receives a series of essentially value-laden reports. And her role then is to synthesize and decide, yeah, between those different reports. Weirdly enough, I'd forgotten this until this morning when I was on the train. This is exactly what Weber himself says, okay, in Science's Vocation. He says what the scientist can do is not tell us which ultimate values to have, but they can tell us which values are inconsistent with one another and how they might or might not fit together. To put it metaphorically, they could say, if you choose this particular standpoint, you will be serving this particular god and essentially giving offense to every other god. So I take it this is like a really deep model, implicit already in notions of scientific advice. One of the advantages of thinking this way, of thinking we don't need scientific advice, as it were. We just need lots of scientific advisors reflecting different positions. I actually think it reflects everyday advice. Yeah? Imagine you go to a doctor, and the doctor says you should have the operation. When you go to bank manager says you shouldn't have the operation. What's going on there? The doctor is telling you, in purely medical terms, have the operation. Along this domain of value, maximize in this way. The bank manager is saying, if you want to preserve your bank balance, don't take 5 weeks off work. And along another domain of value, they're giving you the right option. What your role is, as a human, is to decide how to balance those values. The notion, as it were, that you can have the bank manager doctor committee who come together to tell you what to do given all the values, I think is wrong. Yeah? So I think it fits everyday decision making while retaining expertise. Here's a disadvantage of taking this model seriously. I really think it is worth taking seriously, the notion that we have these multiple perspectives and no way of making those perspectives coherent. It means there is no such thing as the science. Yeah? There's nothing the science can tell you to do, because the science itself will already, you have to be taken in, assessed, and in that sense, and in that sense only, I think it means someone like Piers Corbyn is entirely right. Yeah? Yeah. In some ways. In some ways. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay.